off here with the GI functional anatomy. And we're really going to look at the various structures involved in the GI system and their functions briefly. And then we're also going to look at the layers that make up the GI system. And when we say layers here, we're talking about this tube, right? Remember, the GI tract is a hollow tube. It's going from the oral cavity, from the mouth, all the way to the anus. It's a continuous hollow tube. And so when we speak about layers of the GI, we're really speaking about the layers of that tube. So from the most intimate layer, right, the surface that's coming in contact with the lumen or the luminal surface, all the way out to the superficial layer of that tract, what are the structures, what are the components, where do we have the blood vessels and the nerves and so on. And that's what we mean when we talk about the various layers that make up the GI system. Okay. Let's start by looking at an overview of the processes involved. So we know that in general, the gastrointestinal system is responsible for breaking down and absorbing of food, of nutrients from that food. So when we eat a piece of bread or pasta or a fruit, apple, orange, banana, and we bring it into the GI system, into the stomach specifically, through the esophagus into the stomach, it's really only been masticated or chewed, right? So it's going to be in big pieces, but we need to get those to smaller pieces, or we need to get those macronutrients down to micronutrients in order for them to be absorbed into the GI tract. So here we speak about digestion and then absorption. So digestion is the process of breaking those large food particles down into smaller or micronutrient molecules so that they can be moved across the epithelial layer of the GI tract, and that process we call absorption. So digestion is needed before absorption can take place. We also want to talk about motility and secretion. So motility and secretion are two other processes that are important to aid digestion and absorption. Motility is the process of moving that food along the gut, along that tube. And that happens with a series of relaxation and contraction of the smooth muscle that lines the GI. So we have this rhythmic relaxation followed by contraction over and over, which kind of squeezes the food along the gut tube in a rhythmic way. We call that motion peristalsis. I'm going to talk more about how that's brought about. But that sequence of squeezing and relaxing is what helps to move food along the gut tube. The other part of that is secretion. So secretion is the last process that's involved in aiding digestion and absorption. And that is where we move certain substances, usually mucus or secretory enzymes, digestive juices. We move those secretions from the areas where they're being made into the lumen. So it's going to be the opposite in terms of the direction of absorption. But we're moving substances into the lumen in order to aid that digestion and absorption. And in the case of mucus, that's going to help to lubricate the movement as well. In the case of digestive juices, that's going to help to break down some of those food particles into those micronutrients. So motility and secretion are important in aiding digestion and absorption. Okay, we don't want food stuck in one place in the GI, and we don't want it to be kind of having a hard time moving through because it doesn't have those enzymes and that mucus. Okay, and this schematic is really showing that, representing that, that breakdown of those cellular processes, So we've got the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, where all this mixing is taking place. We've got the accessory glands, right, such as the salivary glands, the liver, the pancreas, that are dumping their secretions into the lumen, into the tube of the GI tract. That is aiding with digestion, so breaking those food particles into smaller pieces. And then that can be followed by absorption, moving those micronutrients across the GI tract into the vascular system, into the blood vessels. And then the rest of that can be eliminated as waste, whatever is unabsorbed or undigested, okay? All right, so that is pretty much an overview of what's happening with the GI system and the 4 processes that are important there. Let's talk about the structure of the GI tract. So it's a hollow tube, it's about 15 feet long. It's going from the mouth to the pharynx, to the esophagus, to the stomach, then the small intestines, then the large intestines or the colon, finally the rectum, which leads to the anus. So from the mouth to the anus, we've got this continuous hollow tube where this food is passing, being absorbed, digested, and motility and secretion are helping with that process. We also have accessory glands that I pointed out earlier. So this is the liver, the salivary glands, which help to moisten food in the oral cavity, the pancreas, which is secreting some of those digestive juices into the lumen as well. So here we can see all of the structures that are involved, and we should know the general anatomy from our lab discussion. So we know the mouth, the pharynx, right, the esophagus, then we get into the stomach. We spoke about the stomach and the different parts of the stomach. The small intestines, which are kind of inside, the large intestines, which are forming the periphery here, and then finally the rectum, and then the anus, which is the opening out of the body, okay? Let's now move on to speak about the layers. So I'm going to do some annotating here, so bear with me. We're going to speak about the layers of the GI tract as we go from the lumen out to the superficial layer. So let's start off by looking at the lumen of the GI. So this is the lumen. So think about this as a cross section of the gut tube, and you're looking in from the center of that tube out towards the periphery of the GI of that tube. So here's the lumen, and then we can speak about the innermost layer, which is called the mucosa. So the mucosa is formed by 3 sub-layers or 3 smaller layers, which start off with the epithelial layer. And we know that epithelia is really the lining tissue of all of our body surfaces. And so likewise, here in the lumen, we're also going to see the epithelia. So we can describe the epithelia as being cells that are lining one next to the other, as we see here. So these are our epithelial cells, and we'll describe what these cells are. They're actually called enterocytes. So we'll talk about what they are and the different types. But this is our epithelial lining, which is a part of the mucosa. Outside of the epithelial layer, we've got the lamina propria. Now the lamina propria is another small layer. This has small vessels and small nerves that are present in this layer. It's still a part of the mucosa, which is the innermost layer, but it's going to be one of the subdivisions of the mucosa. So here we've got the lamina propria. And I'll put here in red a few dots which represent the small blood vessels and the small nerves that are present here. So let's do some in yellow, which are representing the tiny nerve endings. All right, and this is the lamina propria. All right, in brackets here, I'm going to put small blood vessels. and nerves. All right, so that's our second part of the mucosa. The third part of the mucosa is actually a muscular layer. It's called the muscularis mucosae, which means the muscle of the mucosa. And that's going to be the third layer of the mucosa, which is the innermost lining again. So we've got this third layer here, which is a very small layer of smooth muscle. And I'm drawing it here in red so we can see that. This is the muscularis mucosa. Alrighty, and together all of these layers make up the mucosa. Okay, so that's the innermost layer, the mucosa, formed by the epithelial layer, the lamina propria, which is a connective tissue layer where we've got small vessels and nerves, and then the muscularis mucosae, which is a small bit of smooth muscle found in the mucosa. Now, outside of the mucosa, we have the submucosa. And the submucosa is another connective tissue layer where we have much larger vessels and nerves. And here we have the enteric nerve. So this is called the submucosa. And here in the submucosa, we have large vessels and nerves. We also have the submucosal plexus. And a plexus is nothing but a network of nerves. And this is where the autonomic nervous system innervates the GI system. This is the plexus that controls that. One of two plexuses that controls that. This one is called the submucosal plexus, and it's also known as the Meissner's plexus. The Meissner's plexus. Okay. And once again, I'm going to join some larger vessels here so we can see that we've got larger blood vessels in this layer. And excuse my scratchy drawing here. We've got larger veins in this layer. And then obviously we've got larger nerves. We've got this plexus, which are larger. And again, this is communicating the autonomic communication via the enteric plexus or the submucosal plexus. Okay, now let's move off to the third layer, which is the muscularis externa. This is really a thick layer of smooth muscle. So again, I'm drawing it here in red so we can see that this is smooth muscle. And this is a thicker layer of smooth muscle tissue, which we call the muscularis externa. And that literally translates to the outside muscle, right? So we've got the muscularis mucosa, which is the muscle of the mucosa. And then we've got the muscularis externa, which is the outermost muscle. Okay, so here I'm gonna write, this is the thick layer of smooth muscle. We also have here another one of our enteric plexuses. So this is called the Auerbach's plexus. This is another network of nerves that is responsible for the autonomic innervation of the GI, but this one is found in the muscularis externa, and it's called the Auerbach's plexus. Okay. Oops, let's undo that. Okay, bear with me here 1 minute. All right, so I'm just going to draw in these yellow spots so we know that this has that nerve plexus here. And then the final layer is called the serosa. So the serosa is a connective tissue layer as well as a layer of mesothelium, which is a single serous membrane. So the outermost layer is a connective tissue layer. It's called the serosa. So this was the muscularis externa, and then the outermost layer is the serosa. And the serosa is basically a connective tissue layer as well as a serous membrane. And if you remember the serous cavities, so we talked about the peritoneum being a serous cavity. This is that serous membrane that we spoke about as well. So it's that thin layer, one epithelial layer thick, very thin membrane, which is the outermost covering of the GI tract. And it is actually continuous with the peritoneum, and we'll talk about that. Let's see, I see a question here, so I'm going to take a pause. Someone is asking, what are the blue circles? Good question. So those are the small, the veins. So we got small arteries, small veins here in the lamina propria. We also got large arteries and large veins in the submucosa as well. Okay. So these are the 4 layers of the GI tract. We've got the mucosa, which has 3 inner layers, the epithelial lining, the lamina propria, which has small vessels and small nerves, the muscularis mucosa, which is a small layer of smooth muscle within the mucosa. Then we have the submucosa, which is the outer layer of the mucosa. It's going to be large vessels, large nerves, and then the submucosal plexus, which we call the Meissner's plexus. That is followed by the muscularis externa, which is a thick, smooth muscle layer, which also has another enteric plexus here called the Auerbach's plexus. And then the outermost or superficial layer is the serosa, which is a connective tissue layer, and then a serous membrane, a very thin membrane that is continuous with the peritoneum.